Hey everyone, it's Sean. In today's video, I'm going to be walking you through the difference between curves and levels, what they do, and how to make the most of them in your photographs. Now, I'm working on this image that I got from Unsplash. You guys can use any image that you'd like. The techniques are very situational and depend on the effect that you're looking to get from your photograph. So first things first, what I would like to do is I would like to open up my window and go to adjustments. And what we'll see here is it should have hopefully popped up this adjustments panel on your side right-hand toolbar. And the adjustments panel has a lot of really cool things in it, which we'll be getting to over the course of all of our tutorials. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to start with levels. It looks like this sort of graph right here, and it opens up a new panel with properties, and it applies a new layer down here called levels. And what levels does is it controls the depth, the brightness, the shades of all colors really throughout your image, and it sort of can have a drastic impact on the overall look and feel. I just realized I'm still set in CMYK, so I'm just going to quickly change my color mode back over to RGB. I'm going to hit flatten and probably have to open up a new layers or new levels layer in a second. Terrific. So here we go with our levels. So right off the bat, you can sort of see on the far left, we have our levels of black. There aren't really super black blacks. They've all sort of been tinted to be a lighter shade of black, so they feel a little bit more cinematic. And over here we have our whites on the very far right hand side, and you can sort of see this up in our sort of foggy sky, and in a few other areas of this photograph as well. And in the middle we have what's referred to as our midtones. So what we can do here is just grab one of the sliders and start sort of playing around. So if we drag our blacks and bring them in towards the middle, you are enhancing the blacks, or you're doing what's referred to as crushing the blacks. You are making the blacks as inky and rich as possible. Typically, you don't really want to go too far with the blacks, or even with the whites for that matter. You sort of just want to strike this nice balance between the two, and bringing them both in closer towards the center effectively increases the contrast in the image. Sometimes what's best to do if you want to just slightly darken or slightly lighten a photo is use your mid-tones, and you can go in either direction. Dragging towards the whites from your mid-tone will actually increase the amount of darker black tones, and going in the opposite direction towards the blacks will increase the lighter white tones. This is useful depending on what type of aesthetic you're going for within your image. The next thing we can do is affect the output levels, right? So if you want to really bathe something in a nice whitewashed sort of effect, let's say you're using an image sort of as a background and you're expecting to be able to put text over it in InDesign or something like that. You still want your image to show through for flavor, but you don't really want it to be the focal point. You can just really sort of whitewash the blacks, really sort of get rid of them, still retaining your color information, but just making it a nice hazier sort of image all around. That's an option to do there as well. And vice versa, maybe you want to darken it. Maybe this is like the background on a website, and you're going to sort of scroll past this whole photo and have type on top of it, or other design elements. That might be a useful technique for you to sort of apply here as well. So just a couple options on your output levels. The next thing that we can take a look at is sampling sort of black points, sampling gray points, and sampling white points within an image. By doing this, you'll effectively be color toning your image. So here, actually, I'm just going to go up to my history, and I'm going to apply. Okay, great. So I'm going to take a step back so that we are back at our base photo. Double click on my layers panel so that our image is exactly back the way it was. And so you can see here the whites aren't particularly white. They're actually kind of off-white. They feel a little bit green or a little bit yellow to me. And so if we click on our set white balance or our white point, and then we hover over a spot in the image that is supposed to be pure white and click, it will auto adjust the color of our whites to be back to nice, crisp, clean whites. This is a good choice. Like, this is an interesting sort of setting to go about doing stuff with, just because sometimes when you colorize an image, you can take it a little bit too far, right? This is really tastefully done, but you can easily go overboard. And we can do the same thing with the blacks. So this gentleman here is supposed to be wearing all black. So if we click on that, it will sort of just deepen our blacks to what they're supposed to be. Very subtle, but still very effective. And so I'm actually going to do that. And this is more of a neutral version of what our photograph was supposed to look like, right? Before the original photographer brought it into Photoshop or Lightroom and sort of did their own color corrections. Kind of a nifty tool to learn and to go about. One other thing I'd like to show you about levels before we move on is, man, I got stuck back in CMYK again. Sorry about that, guys. I'm just going to switch back over. It's because I went and sort of went back in history states a couple times. So sorry about that. I'm just jumping back. And I'm back. Okay, cool. For those of you that were doing this in RGB the entire time, good job. I was still a little bit confused. So the other thing about this levels menu here that's kind of interesting to note is that you have presets that you can use. So if you just want darker, increased contrast, all that sort of stuff. If you want lighter shadows, the option is there. Midtones to be brighter, all sorts of stuff. I'm just going to set this back to default and we'll still be golden. The other aspect that we can do is we can actually go in and adjust specific channels of our RGB color space. So you can select red, and now we can actually adjust the shadows, the dark points of our red tones. And you'll notice that by sort of adjusting these tones, you're not actually making the image more or less red, you're bringing in more greens. There's going to be a menu I'll show you guys later on that will have a much better visual spectrum of what's happening in here. But for now, just sort of know that when you're working in these color spaces, when you're adjusting the darks more towards the midpoint, you're effectively eliminating that color. And when you're adjusting the highlights toward the midpoint, you're effectively bringing more of that color in, and vice versa with our midtone slider here. So I'm just going to keep undoing until I get back to my original sort of state. And you can do the same thing with the other channels. Green will bring in more red, and will eliminate, or will bring in more green rather from the other side. And blue will sort of bring in more of a reddish, greenish, yellow tone, and vice versa. It'll bring in more blue highlights. So just kind of really fun, easy ways to affect color within your photo. The next thing that I'd like to show you guys is our curves tool. And for that, I'm going to open up a new photo just because we've been working with this one for a while. And we're going to work from that. So the next photo that I have is again from Unsplash. It's another Toronto photograph. Here we have our Toronto sign. And this is going to be really good for when we look at curves. So curves, again, is in your adjustments panel here. There is a new layer. It looks like a line graph. It is your curves panel. And if we click that, you'll see we have our histogram just like we do with our levels. That's called the histogram right there. With curves, it's a little bit different. And how we look at this is instead of having in levels, so I'm going to keep creating a new layer. Don't mind me, guys. So in levels, we have our highlight, our shadows, and our midpoint, right? And in curves, what we have is our highlights, our shadows, and our midpoint is sort of right in the center of this whole space. Whenever you click on this line, you will create a new anchor point, or you could just actually sort of click and drag up to adjust right away if you know what you're doing. But a good rule of thumb for starting out is to place an anchor point in the middle, because it'll just give you a little bit more control over your highlights and your shadows. This is our output levels, just like we experimented with in levels. It's just down here this time. We have the same controls in terms of original blacks, neutrals, and whites, so you can adjust that. This sort of tool here is telling us that we are, or this line tool is telling us that we are using a line that's available on our graph. And if we selected the pencil, you could actually draw your own line from scratch. Very dangerous. If you know what you're doing, amazing. That could be a useful tool for you. Personally, I find I still like the training wheels of the sort of preconceived line myself, even though I'm still very adept with this tool. Just having that as a base is still a good place to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the top right, and I'm going to start fiddling around with my highlights. And what we can do is if we drag our highlights down towards the bottom, what it's doing is it's sort of flattening our whites. It's making them in a way not as hot, not as bright. And so if you want a more muted photo, that could definitely be one way to go about getting it. Vice versa, you can do that with blacks as well. You can drag them up and they become less inky, they become more hazy, right? Whoops, sorry, I accidentally clicked something there. So if you drag them up, they become less inky and more hazy. And so I'm just gonna place my anchor point back there. My apologies for that. So that's sort of one thing to think about in terms of highlights and shadows. If we ever get to a point where we want to bring our curves back to where we started, you can just hit reset curves. So let's go ahead and do that. I clicked on this hamburger menu and I'm going to hit reset curves. And so what happens is if we drop an anchor point in the center once more, and we sort of come in between the highlights and the midpoint, we can click and drag another anchor point up, and you can see how that's making the curve sort of effect just in between here. It's sort of hit down in here a little bit, but not too much. It just had a minor impact on the line below the midpoint. But by placing an anchor point and dragging it up along our histogram, you're sort of affecting the whites right where they're going to peak, and you're creating these really hot whites. You've added a lot more contrast to the photo with minimal effort, and the same can go down here, where if we just sort of take an anchor point and drag it down to the low point of our histogram for the blacks, you've really gone and created a super contrasty photo that's eliminated any type of haze, which could be nice if that's the aesthetic you're going for. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. I find that this black is probably a little bit too contrasty for my taste. So to get some information back, what you can do is you can click on our sort of black shadowy point down at the very bottom and drag it in closer towards our, whoops, sorry. Again, I keep accidentally hitting the wrong button. You can drag it in closer towards our other point. And what you'll notice is the curve really wants to do something crazy the closer you get it. So you want to find this nice sort of midpoint between the curve being too crazy and just sort of being curved enough. And you can get some of that information back from our black sort of setting, and vice versa. We can drag our whites down and sort of calm down the peaking highlights that are happening. So that's sort of how you control highlights, shadows, low points, things like that within curves. They can be very fun to play around with. What I suggest sometimes is looking at your favorite photographer or inspiration on Instagram and really thinking what is making those images color toned in that specific way. We'll look at an example like that coming up, but I just kind of want you guys to maybe be a little bit more critical when you're scrolling through your social media and stuff like that, and really think about how are these photos technically being edited to create their aesthetic. Next, under curves, you can see we have the same options we had as before with our levels panel, where you can affect all these sort of different contrasts and lighting conditions. And again, we can go and start affecting the different color channels, right? So we can add more red, we can subtract more red, or we can subtract red and add in more green. And you have a lot of control over this too, which is really nice. So let's say you wanted to have a lot of blue shadows, right? So you can put a anchor point in the midpoint of your red graph here, and you can set another one and just sort of drag it down just a little bit, or actually we need to drag it up just a little bit. And you can already start to see we're getting sort of this like vintage, it almost feels like 1970s sort of film footage that's being applied just by changing one channel of color. The next thing we can do is we can jump down to blue, and we can place a midpoint anchor and sort of bring up the blues, and you can make it really, the whites sort of nice and icy blue, or you can bring them down and sort of make it more of a vintage hazy-ish yellow green color. And just by sort of making those two adjustments, we've really color graded our image to make it feel a little bit more emotional, a little bit more evocative of something. So depending on the type of project you're going for, maybe this sort of color treatment can have a positive impact on the imagery, but it's definitely always worth sort of playing around with color tones and things of that nature. So in the next video, I'm going to be grabbing an image from Instagram and sort of trying to replicate some of the color tones that are coming through it in just any other photo. So stick around and we'll walk through that one together as well. See ya.